Good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Lapointe with Colden Company, and welcome to our webinar, Maintaining Regulatory Compliance. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you do have questions, feel free to use the Q&A function inside of WebEx, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the presentation. So before we get started here, of course, just want to wish everyone well, make sure everybody is safe and sound during these unusual times here. A little bit about Colden Company here. We are an information technology service organization. We're computer guys and gals. We've been in business since 2003, so we're approaching our 17-year anniversary here in a couple of weeks. We have two offices, one in St. Augustine, Florida, which is where I'm talking to you from today, and another one up in Ballston Spa, New York. Our customer footprint extends out into 15 different states as well as countries outside the U.S. And we have many leading technical certifications, and what's pertinent for today's presentation, we do have security certifications from CompTIA. So enough about us, let's get right into our agenda here. What we're going to be talking about today is why compliance is important. We're going to talk about the process for compliance, generally speaking. Then more specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about the NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology. They have something called their cybersecurity framework. We're going to spend a little bit of time focusing on that one, and we'll explain why when we get there. And then, of course, at the end, we'll take some Q&A. Okay, so why is compliance important? Well, certainly compliance with legislation or other non-governmental statutes, and there I'm thinking about things like payment card industry, which is PCI data security standards. Those are not enforced by a government, they're enforced by an industry. But complying with those types of statutes and regulations are a requirement for doing business. I'm going to open up a poll question here in WebEx. And the question is are you doing work with the federal government? If you are, you probably already know that there's a statute called the NIST 800-171, which is what any private business that's doing business with the federal government must comply with. You can lose your government contract by being out of compliance with NIST 800. So it's certainly a requirement for doing business in that situation and other situations as well. But beyond that, compliance can really provide competitive advantages. So I often encourage our customers, if you do have to comply with a particular standard, maybe it's HIPAA, or if you're in New York, they have something called the CR 500 for financial institutions. If you're compliant with those, tout those. Those can be differentiators, especially if you're in a field where security matters, financial services, payroll, accounting. Tout your security. That can be a competitive advantage for your business. And of course, lastly, the whole point of compliance is to lower the risk to the business. That's the whole reason these things have come about, to lower the risk of hacks and data breaches and things like that. So ultimately, compliance can lower the risk to your business, and consequently, it can lower your insurance costs. If you've ever gotten a cybersecurity policy, you know that how you answer those questions can determine your cost. So being able to provide information and documentation that you're compliant is certainly going to help you out and get you, a better price. Okay, looking at our poll question, doesn't look like we've got anybody on today that's doing work with the federal government. Interesting. Okay, moving on here. Another reason why compliance is important is governments are taking compliance much more seriously. So state PII, which stands for Personal Identifiable Information, those laws are becoming more aggressive. So a few years ago, we sat here on a webinar and we predicted that states would be strengthening and standardizing their state PII laws. And we didn't have to be Nostradamus to do that. That was coming right out of the Conference of Governors, the 2018 Conference of Governors. That was their stated objective. Because every state is different, they all had different statutes back in 2018 at the time. Not every state even had one. Alabama was the last state to the table. They now have a law on the books to protect private data. So all 50 states now do, but they were all over the map. Some states like Florida were very generic, just saying businesses have to take reasonable precautions. Other states are much more specific. If you're in New York, you probably already know that they updated their law, something called the SHIELD Act, that went into full effect last month in March. So that is exactly what's been happening. We're seeing states not only standardize, but strengthen their laws, increase the penalties, becoming more assertive in what businesses are going to have to do to maintain data security. So that's at the state level. At the federal level, the government is also regulating much more closely. And that goes for governments even outside the United States. You may have heard of GDPR. That's the European Union standard that went into effect. Beyond that, Singapore and Vietnam updated their data security policies last year as well. So this is a global thing that's happening. So federal governments are taking this much more seriously, as well as state governments. And the fines are increasing. So I'm just going to give you some examples of some of the fines that have been levied out there. Marriott fined $124 million. And that wasn't even for their latest breach. They just had a breach a couple months ago where more customer data was taken. Wondering what that next fine will be for them. Equifax was kind of the granddaddy of all breaches. That one particularly bothers me. $575 million seems like a big fine. They should have been fined out of existence, if you ask me. Really irresponsible, and really important data like Social Security numbers were stolen in that one. Uber fined $148 million for a breach of customer information there. So those are big ticket fines that you probably heard about on the news. What you're not hearing about on the news are all the smaller companies that are getting fined now as well. So governments are taking compliance much more seriously. Another example here, another one just to add because a lot of people have heard about it, is the Target breach. Now, if you think about it, the state PII laws are all different. Target had to settle with 47 different states over their breach. Now, what a pain in the neck that is, right? Their total fines that were levied across the board totaled about $18.5 million. But Target estimated that their total cost of remediation for that breach was over $200 million. And if you know the story there, the breach at Target actually came from their HVAC vendor, who inadvertently allowed a hacker into the system here. So I was lucky enough to talk to the chief information officer who was at Target at the time. He is no longer there, but he kind of explained how a lot. Pretty fascinating study. And if you're in healthcare, Accretive Health was fined $1.55 million for what? For a stolen laptop that contained health information, electronic private health information. It wasn't like their main server got hacked. This was a laptop with data on it. Now, granted, it was a lot of records on that laptop. The other interesting thing about this particular breach, although the fine was $1.55 million, if you looked at the value of the company on the day before the breach and a year to date after the breach, the company lost $688 million in value. So the breach had a very, very negative effect on them. In fact, they were even barred from doing business in the state of Minnesota for a period of time. Another example, Oregon Health and Science University was fined $2.7 million, again, a stolen laptop. The fine was high because that was their second offense. And I could go on. There's a lot of multi-million-dollar examples of fines levied because people's health information has been stolen. So those are all reasons why compliance is important. Okay, so let's move on here. We've established that. Let's move on to the process for compliance. So the first step really is to appoint someone in your organization to oversee compliance. Now, some of our customers are large, some of them are not. So the key here is it does have to be someone from inside your organization. You can't outsource that. You can't say, all right, Colden company, you're my IT company, you're going to be in charge of our compliance. It doesn't work that way. If you think back to Sarbanes-Oxley, when that came out, the chief executive officer, chief financial officer, they had to sign off on the company's financials. And that was so the government had somebody's throat to choke in case there was a problem, right? And this is really the same thing. They're asking for someone in the organization. Now, I say they, well, who is they? It really depends on the regulation that we're talking about. But in general, if you look at a lot of these regulations that we're listing down here below, the NIST 800, HIPAA, many of the state PII regulations, they are requiring that you have to have someone in your organization to do that. So that's a good idea. We're suggesting that you make that step one. Okay, I'm going to open up another poll question here. And that poll question is have you ever had a breach in your organization? So go ahead and answer that while I continue on with this slide here and move on to step number 2. Step number 2, once you've got someone in charge, then you need to know what regulations your organization needs to comply with. PCI, again, it's the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards. If you accept credit cards, even one, that's a regulation that you need to comply with. There are different levels to PCI, but it is something that almost all businesses need to comply with. We mentioned the NIST 800-171 earlier. That's for those that do work with the federal government. HIPAA, most people know that, health information, but most people just assume that applies to doctors and dentists. But it really can apply to other organizations as well. If you're doing insurance, health insurance for your customer or your employees, and you're housing that type of information, that is protected. So HIPAA can apply to a little bit broader spectrum than many people believe. And of course, the state PII laws are in there as well. If you're in financial services, there's GLB, Graham-Leach-Bliley. If you're doing business with the European Union, there's GDPR. If you're a financial services company in New York State, there's the CR 500. There's a lot of regulations out there. Your job as a compliance manager is to know which ones of those you need to comply with. So I'm reading the poll results here, and the majority of folks are saying, no, we haven't had a breach. The question I always like to ask is, have you ever had ransomware affect your business? And the answer is, statistically, it's a lot more than people think. There's a good chunk of small business that have been affected by ransomware. That is considered a breach. If a hacker has gotten into your system, it used to be, with the New York State standard as an example, you had to know that data was exfiltrated out of your organization to consider that a breach. And as we mentioned, a lot of the states are strengthening their laws. Now, if you've had a ransomware attack, whether or not they pulled information off of your network or not, you still have to consider that a breach. So I think there's a lot more businesses out there than they think that really have had a breach. Okay, so there's a lot of information to digest, right? So the next step, step 3, is to understand the regulation you're looking to comply with. So that can be tricky, especially if you're a small business and you don't have someone who can be dedicated to researching this. You don't have a full-time compliance manager. How do you keep up with all this stuff? That is definitely a challenge. The answer to that really is to partner with somebody. Partner with an expert. Partner with someone that's going to help you keep up, someone that knows the regulations, keeps up with the regulations. So it's important to note that compliance is a process. It's not a one-time event. Almost every regulation, if you look at them in detail, is going to have some type of stipulation that says you have to have some type of recurring assessments or ongoing process to evaluate changing conditions. And that makes sense because things do change, right? Regulations change, threats change, things inside your business change. So taking that deep dive and understanding the regulation you're looking to comply with is step 3. partner with someone if that's not something you have time to do. Because not knowing the law is not an excuse for noncompliance. If it were, I'd never get a speeding ticket, right? I'm sorry, officer, I thought the speed limit was 60 here. Oh, I didn't realize it was 35. I wish that worked. It doesn't, and it doesn't work here either. So not knowing the law is not an excuse for noncompliance. Okay, so to help you understand the regulation, and this goes really for any regulation. This is a general process here. It's a general workflow. We call it assess, mitigate, maintain. Assess where you're at versus the regulation, mitigate the shortcomings or gaps. You can call that a gap analysis. And finally, maintain a program to stay in compliance after you've gotten where you want to be. So we're going to look at each one of these steps in a little bit more detail here, starting with the assess component. Again, you're comparing your situation against the requirements that are laid out in the regulation. Document, document, document. So you want to document each component and whether or not your business meets, partially meets, or fails to meet the objectives stated in the regulation. So the end result of an assessment is not full compliance, and that's something that sometimes folks are confused by. We tell them, all right, we're going to do an assessment to see where you stand versus your state's PII law, and they think at the end of that, we're going to be compliant. No, that's not the purpose of an assessment. The end result is just an understanding of where you're at versus the regulation. Okay, at least at this point after the assessment, you've done that gap analysis, you know what the requirements are, and you know where your shortcomings are. That's the purpose of assess. Now, if you want to do something about those shortcomings or those gaps, that's where you move to the mitigate phase. This is where you're going to resolve those shortcomings to meet the objectives. And again, you'll notice I have the word document here quite a few times in my slides, because you want to document any changes you're making to your processes and procedures, including when those changes were made and by whom. That's great documentation in case of an audit, or God forbid, you're doing recovery from a breach. Okay, this step, this mitigate step, is a step where you may have to spend some money, right? You might need to add some products or services or do some things here to get you where you want to be. So this is the step that might take a little while because maybe your business can't afford to do everything that the statute is recommending. Certain requirements like the New York State SHIELD Act does give some leeway to smaller businesses. If your business is under $3 million a year in revenue or under 50 employees, they give you some leeway. Now, it's very vague. They just tell you that you can scale your solutions to your size. They don't give you any specifics like, oh, you don't have to have an incident response plan or you don't have to do a full risk assessment. They don't tell you those specifics, but they do tell you that your solutions can scale to your size. If you have that documented, now you've got something to stand on. If you put in there, okay, we've done A, B, and C, we could not do D because that would be a financial hardship for us this year. At least you've got it documented and you've got something to go to the state with in case of an audit or breach. Okay, let's move on to the maintain component here. This is where you're going to prepare a program to maintain compliance going forward. And as I mentioned, almost all of the regulatory objectives that we talked about require that. It's going to state in there you have to do periodic or regular assessments to review your situation. Because as we said, your situations change. The regulations might change. The threats that are out there might change. Your company might change. So there's a lot of things that can change and why you have to do this as an ongoing process. Okay, so you can't be compliant without documentation. And I'm going to repeat that because you can be secure without documentation, but you can't be compliant. If you don't have that documentation, you cannot prove compliance. So if you're in an audit or a breach situation, you will be required to provide documentation. And you're either going to be scrambling to get it, a lot of these regulations. So we have formal programs that help businesses comply with HIPAA, the PCI data security standard, the NIST cybersecurity framework. We're going to spend some time on that one specifically, and I'll explain that on the next slide here. Also, we have a cybersecurity insurance compliance program, and I'm not going to go into too much detail there. That's going to be the subject of a future webinar with us. But if you've ever tried to get cybersecurity insurance, you probably know that it's very difficult to actually get paid on those types of policies because there's a lot of exceptions and loopholes and things like that that make it so the insurance companies don't have to pay out. We have a program in place that will virtually guarantee that you would get paid out if you were to have a breach, but that's a subject for another day. So there's some regulations that are not listed here. If you have a specific one that you need to comply with and you would like help with that, by all means, let us know. We recently had a customer in a specific state ask us for assistance with their state PII regulation, and we did that. We researched it for them and gave them, we did the assess component of it here. So we can help with those. But we have formal programs in place for these things here. Okay, so the reason I wanted to focus on the NIST cybersecurity framework in particular is because many regulations are based on this. We mentioned that a lot of the states are trying to standardize and strengthen their data protection laws. Well, guess what they're standardizing around? They're standardizing around the NIST cybersecurity framework. So if you were to look at the new Alabama law that came on the books and compare that to the New York State SHIELD Act, which just went into effect in full last month, there's a lot of common verbiage in there. Looks like, geez, maybe Alabama copied New York's law. No, but what they did is they both looked at the same base for the framework of their law, and that framework was the NIST cybersecurity framework. So this is an excellent baseline for businesses to use and to have documentation for. Another change in a lot of the state PII laws is that they are now reaching beyond state boundaries. So it's not like I am not in New York, so I don't have to worry about the New York State SHIELD Act. That used to be the case. But now what states are saying is if you're housing information on any of our residents, whether your business is based in California, in Russia, it doesn't matter, you are subject to our New York State SHIELD Act if you are housing information on our folks. And other states are doing the same thing. California updated theirs recently. Texas, they're doing the same thing. So if you're doing business in multiple states, now all of a sudden you need to worry about what's the law for Vermont, what's the law for New York, what's the law for Pennsylvania, all these different states you need to worry about. What makes it easier is if you say, all right, I'm going to go with the NIST cybersecurity framework, and I'm going to use that, and I'm going to comply with that, and I'm not going to worry about all the different states individually. And if I do have some type of audit or a breach, I'm going to show them that I'm following the NIST cybersecurity framework, and that's going to show that you as a business are taking initiative and you're making an effort to comply. So that's one of the reasons we're really going to be focusing on the NIST framework today. Okay, so here's a little graphic here that talks about the different components to the cybersecurity framework. There's 5 components here. They start with identifying risks. That would be part of the assess component of things. Protect against those threats. You have to have something in place to detect those threats. A formal response plan, or sometimes called an incident response plan. And then recover, get your business back to normal afterwards. So they've broken it down into these 5 steps. This is what they call their framework 1.1 that was updated in April of 2018. So it's now 2 years old. That's the newest revision of the cybersecurity framework. And it's very comprehensive. It digs into more than just technology. And the end result is it's going to create a profile of your business and against the NIST cybersecurity framework. So the program that we're offering here goes through the specific things in each one of those sections and comes up with a profile of your business. And if you want to think of it as a gap analysis, think of it as a gap analysis. Okay, so some basic principles of NIST, and this is from their own site here. They talk that the framework has common and accessible language. It's adaptable to many different technologies and life cycle phases. What I want you to think there when you read that is vague. It's not specific. So they're going to say things like you need to have a risk assessment. They're not going to get into specifics on what that risk assessment needs to cover. It's going to tell you you need to have an incident response plan. It's not going to tell you what the different components of that incident response plan need to be. So it is high level. It is risk-based, as they say. So it's part of that initial identify section there is to identify the specific risks for your business. Based on international standards, they call it a living document, which means it will update. So as NIST makes changes, this program will update with it. And it's, again, not a one-time thing. Compliance is not a one-time event. It's a continual event. So that's what that means by it's a living document. And finally, guided by many perspectives, private sector, academia, public sector, it does cover them all. Again, it's a kind of a general framework that they're providing here. Okay, so if we want to get into some a little bit more specifics, and there's a lot to it, so we're not going to get into every single specific detail and requirement in NIST. That's what the program is for. But I just wanted to point out just some basic things that you should have. Again, appoint a cybersecurity compliance manager. Doesn't have to be a full-time person, but someone in your organization needs to be responsible for that. Regular risk assessments. You have to have an incident response plan. You have to provide cybersecurity training for your employees. A lot of the states are requiring that, and NIST requires that as well. And proactive monitoring. So you have to have some type of mechanism in place to detect intrusions, detect threats. So those are just 5 of the bullet points of high-level things that are required under the framework here. So what the program is going to do, it's going to provide regular assessments of where your business is at. So as we said, it may not be feasible for you to address everything in one chunk. Excuse me. But what this process does is shows your progression. It's going to give you documentation that you can print out regularly. You can print it out on demand. We mentioned that blue documentation button that if you want to print that to get your stuff. That's what this program does. If you're audited, just go in and print your reports. It shows everything that you've done. And of course, it gives you regular updates to the process and program as things change. So we really feel that this is a great tool for handling multiple regulations. Okay, wrapping up here, we're closing in on 11:30 here. In summary, not knowing your responsibilities is not an excuse for noncompliance. It is your job to know what regulations your organization needs to comply with. It's important to note that governments are getting serious about data security. The fines are increasing. We want you to be prepared. We don't want you to be a victim. And we talked about the NIST cybersecurity framework as a good baseline for small and mid-sized business. It's going to help you cover a number of bases and a number of regulations with that. And finally, you can't be compliant without documentation. I've mentioned that several times here, and we really believe that. Okay, wrapping up here, this is a quote that we usually end our webinars with. If you're running your business the same way you were 2 or 3 years ago, you're not staying the same, you're falling behind. And that's because things change. Your competition's changing. They're keeping up with things. Regulations are changing, threats are changing. So you have to be adaptable as a business. The other thing we often quote along with this, there was a Forbes study that shows that businesses that embrace technology outperform those that do not. So, we're here to help. That's what we're here to do. We can help you stay current. We can help you with your regulatory compliance objectives. And to any questions, feel free to use the Q&A to send them my way. And while that's happening, I'm going to put my contact information up on the screen here, phone number and email address. Always feel free to reach out to me with any questions. Always happy to help. Okay, so let me get to the first question here. What is the process if we do have a breach? And that's a good question. I hate answering questions with depends, but it really does depend on the regulation. So that's why it's important to know the regulation that you're trying to comply with. So if we take HIPAA as an example, you have to report any breaches to the Office of Human Services. If you're talking about a breach of data and the state PII law, you have to report that to the state attorney's general office. So it used to be in the New York law, as an example, if you had a breach of health information and you were in New York, they said, all right, you can just report that to the feds and you're good. And with their new regulation that is now in full effect, they changed that. And they said, all right, you have to report that to the feds, but you have to report it to us too. So everybody wants to get their piece of skin out of you, I guess, if you have that breach. So if you do have a breach, the process of what you're going to do is going to depend on the regulation. So I hope I've answered that. Looks like there's only one more out here. Is NIST a guideline or a regulation? And so I guess to answer that, NIST is actually an agency, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So that's a government agency that will make recommendations and guidelines on a number of different things. So the NIST cybersecurity framework, if you're specifically referring to that which we covered, that is not actually a regulation. That is a framework to comply with different regulations. And it's a framework that a lot of the state regulations are based on, which is why it's a good one to follow. Now, if you're talking about NIST 800-171, which we also mentioned in the presentation, that is a regulation. So that one is not a guideline. That is something that you need to follow. Okay, those were the only questions that came in. So I hope that you found our presentation helpful and valuable today. And again, please feel free to reach out to me at any time if I can answer any questions or help your organization in any way. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Have a wonderful day.